Namaskar and welcome to Diplomatic Dispatch. I'm your host, Vikas, Suri. Classical diplomacy has always been about building, maintaining and leveraging a country's foreign relations to advance a country's national interests. It involves the management of political challenges, tensions and conflict situations through negotiation, persuasion and compromise. But since the end of the Second World War, we have seen the emergence of what is called economic diplomacy, using diplomatic skills with economic tools to advance a country's business, political and strategic goals, and it will be the subject of our episode tonight. In a sense, economic diplomacy is as old as diplomacy itself. Commercial exchanges with foreign empires had been established by the kingdoms of Middle Egypt as well as the Indus Valley civilization thousands of years ago. Kautilya's Arthashastra, dating back to the 4th century BC, has extensive reference to the management of economic affairs. Later, the Silk routes of India and China provided renewed impulse for interstate contacts and contracts, as well as war and conquest. After all, trade was the driving force in the spread of colonialism. In the modern era, attracting investment and business opportunities have become key tasks for diplomats. And economic diplomacy covers everything, from trade promotion to tourism expansion, from technology acquisition to aid management, from negotiating free trade agreements to building a country's brand. The advent of globalization and the establishment of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development in 1964 gave a fresh impetus to economic diplomacy. But it was the creation of the World Trade Organization in 1995 that introduced new elements into the mix. Economic diplomacy now also includes the management of multilateral trade relations and the matrix of regulatory issues. It is clear, therefore, that economic diplomacy is vital in an increasingly interdependent world where goods, services and capital are crossing borders seamlessly and countries are competing for scarce markets, technology and resources. So what are the new trends in economic diplomacy? How does India practice it? And what is the future scenario? To answer these questions, I am joined by two outstanding experts. With me in the studio is Ambassador Navdeep Suri. He served in the Indian Foreign Service for 36 years, headed the West Africa and Public Diplomacy divisions in the Ministry of External Affairs, and was India's ambassador to Egypt, Australia, and the UAE. He has also translated 3 classic Punjabi works of his grandfather, Nanak Singh, into English. Now a distinguished fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, he was till recently the director of the ORF Center for New Economic Diplomacy. And joining us from Mumbai is Manjeet Kripalani, the co-founder and executive director of Gateway House, Indian Council on Global Relations. She has worked previously at Worth and Forbes magazines, was India's bureau chief of Business Week, and has received several awards for her work in journalism and advocacy. Let me begin with you, Ambassador Suri. You have argued in a recent paper that it was the setting up of the Indian Technical and Economic Cooperation Program in 1964 that set the foundations of modern India's economic diplomacy. How revolutionary was that step, and how has India's economic diplomacy evolved since then?
I think it was something that was way ahead of its times because within a couple of years of our independence, like in the early 50s, we were already doing some development assistance to Burma and to Nepal. And in 1964, when we were still a very poor country, we had the vision to establish the Indian Technical and Economic Cooperation Program, which over the last 6 decades has really been a flagship for India's development partnerships around the world. It's grown to a point where we now finance 12,000 scholarships from various countries to study in India. I really think that it showed an early recognition of the salience of economic relations as an integral part of diplomacy, and the fact that development cooperation could really help you win hearts and minds before that phrase became popular much later.
Yeah, but what is the modern variation of the ITEC program and India's economic diplomacy?
I think where it's really evolved is that as we've become a bit better resourced in India, we've established the Development Partnerships Administration in the Ministry of External Affairs. We now use lines of credit on very concessional rates as really our spearhead for economic cooperation, for development cooperation with various countries. Currently, we're doing over $10 billion of lines of credits, and these have really become the instrument of choice. They have helped create infrastructure projects, connectivity projects, industrial projects, capacity building, and a whole host of other areas. So the traditional training programs that were done under ITEC and maybe some small projects that were done under ITEC is now complemented in very large measure by our lines of credit.
And our project exports as well.
Of course.
Turning to you, Manjeet ji. The COVID-19 pandemic has negatively affected global economic growth beyond anything experienced in nearly a century. What are the challenges to economic diplomacy that this virus has unleashed, and what is the way forward?
So first, COVID taught us the dangers of an over-centralized globalization. Even though India was never in the globalization supply chain, we now are through the vaccines, increased digitalization for export and for the home market, and the domestic push for manufacturing and ease of doing business. As our foreign minister has said, we are now in the era of decentralized globalization, where every country aims to be Atmanirbhar and self-sufficient because they need jobs at home for political and economic stability. No more exporting jobs to China, no matter what Goldman Sachs or the German multinationals say. So India is now firmly in that space, and all the policies are in place. We now await a manufacturing takeoff. So the way forward, it used to be, Vikas, that the flag followed trade, just like as in the East India Company. And with the West, trade followed the flag, especially with the China model. India has neither. We are not really focused on economic diplomacy. Our place, in the way the West is or in the way China has. China has really maxed it and mastered it. So our place in the world was political and not economic. Now we are learning about our economic value and our market weight, and we have to emphasize our economic advantages, not necessarily to merge our trade and diplomatic missions, the way New Zealand and Australia have done, but our missions now need to work in line with private companies individually and involve their creative ideas in our active economic diplomacy outreach, not just through the chambers of commerce.
Ambassador Suri, although economic diplomacy has been an integral part of Indian foreign policy since independence, it has never been as prominent a part of Indian diplomacy and soft power as in the past decade. Prime Minister Modi has himself tasked the network of Indian missions and posts abroad to further the goal of creating Brand India by promoting the 5 T's: talent, tradition, tourism, trade, and technology. How have our missions risen to the task?
I think this has really set new challenges for our diplomatic missions. We have started working on all of these, but the outcomes have not been evenly distributed, let me put it this way. When you talk about talent in terms of our exporting talent or our attracting talent from other countries, you run into the whole gamut of immigration sentiment in various countries. And you see whether it's a controversy over H-1B visas, etc. And you see that there is a challenge there, despite the best efforts of the government. Similarly, on tourism, while the Incredible India campaign has been taken in different countries, the reality is that 2 years of COVID has really had an impact on our efforts. But on the other hand, our concerted efforts to promote Indian tradition, particularly yoga, I think the fact that the International Yoga Day is today celebrated across the world. I was seeing these wonderful images last week of yoga being performed in a park in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, where probably a few years back somebody would have called it haram. That means that the efforts that we are making consistently over the last few years to promote, whether it's Ayurveda, whether it is traditional knowledge, whether it is yoga, that has really taken off. Trade has taken off. I think our exports are doing better than ever before. And I expect that some of the recent policy initiatives of the government, the PLI scheme, for example, the new thinking on special economic zones, is really going to be a multiplier for Indian exports. So I think it depends on which T you are looking at, and the response may be varied.
Manjeet ji, in the wake of the pandemic, one of the central tasks of economic diplomacy has been ensuring supply chain resilience. It has forced countries to diversify supplies and to prioritize domestic production. For instance, Japan moved $26 billion worth of investments out of China and allocated $2.2 billion to support its domestic industries. The US invoked the Defense Production Act of 1950 to expand production in the United States. And Brazil, Canada, Italy, Russia, and South Korea gave state aid to domestic manufacturers to increase production. But how can countries maintain supply chain resilience in a post-pandemic world?
So Vikas, back to Minister Jaishankar's decentralized globalization, with companies now looking to manufacture in their home countries, and some of the imbalance of this runaway, reckless, and unethical globalization will now be corrected. The two elements. I think that we need new models of trade. Trade is increased everywhere, but it's been very lopsided, right? And so we need trade models that are less rigid and that allow new and more tentative entrants into the global trade regimes like India, and they must be able to enter without fear or heavy domestic consequences. As we know, Indian states, we do not have our own internal free trade, and there are many developing countries like us in the same position. Second, mega trade agreements, which are already vested in the status quo, find it painful and unrealistic to change, right? They don't really want to change. They made all these investments and they don't want to write it off. So it's better for countries like India to enter supply chains with trusted partners, say with the Quad, which is focused on supply chain resilience, and where we have advantageous codependencies like pharma and critical minerals. Most important is the trust factor, right? So we have to be able to have partners who we trust. And so I think that what we will find now with supply chain resilience is that countries are looking to hold hands with partners they trust and really make an effort to look at futuristic, resilient supply chains that are not obviously dependent on each country. India is starting to work. I think we looked at the way India was trying to be an alternative to these countries. We didn't have our policies in place last year, but I think now we're getting better and better, as Navdeep says.
Ambassador Suri, there is little doubt that India's hopes of becoming a 5 trillion economy and of achieving 8% annual growth are dependent in good measure on the private sector. How is India's economic diplomacy facilitating the private sector?
Let me give you two examples from my own experience, Vikas, during my last assignment as ambassador to UAE. We worked as a diplomatic mission very, very closely with the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, which is the world's second largest sovereign fund with assets of some $800 billion. As a result of those efforts, Abu Dhabi Investment Authority became the first anchor investor into the master fund of the National Infrastructure Investment Fund. $1 billion was put in. We have seen hundreds of millions of dollars coming into some of our leading private sector companies, into Renew and Greenco as a case in point, into HDFC Capital for building affordable infrastructure. So I think the challenge really is first to carry the message of the India story to your interlocutors, identify who can do what, and connect them with the right people on the other side. A more recent example, which is again a culmination of efforts that have been underway for the last few years, is the announcement made only a few weeks back for 3 major business groups from UAE to invest several $100 million into Jammu and Kashmir. Now, this has both an economic and a strategic significance. The fact that the Emaar Group has announced that it would build an Emaar Mall of Srinagar, some 500,000 square feet of retail space with adjacent facilities, is huge as a political message. For DP World to say that they are putting up a logistics park, or the Lulu Group to say that they are putting up a food processing. So I'm giving you examples where you target particular companies and see whether you can offer them opportunities that are relevant to them.
And I think we are also working very closely now with the apex industry organizations like CII, FICCI, ASSOCHAM, etc.
That has been there for quite a long time. Sometimes the organizations do very well in terms of promotional efforts. Sometimes it doesn't work. State governments are becoming quite active in investment promotion efforts. And again, what we see is a varying picture. Some states come very well prepared with their investment delegations. They've already got an EY or KPMG or PwC doing the homework for them. Others come for a junket, have a good time and go back. And that's a reality that we, as diplomatic missions, face. We make our best effort to make sure that they get relevant and meaningful meetings, that we do the hand-holding with state delegations. But at the end of the day, because of India's federal structure, we have to keep in mind that our investment promotion efforts are going to be only as successful as the responsiveness of the states to which the investment will actually go.
Absolutely. Manjeet ji, turning the last question around, what is the private sector doing to amplify the economic diplomacy of the government?
Yes, so I want to say that bringing up the chambers of commerce, Navdeep, I think that they have, the problem is that India's private sector has always worked through the chambers, right? India's private sector really doesn't realize its own strength. So for the last 2 decades, one great example is the software industry. For the last 2 decades, India's software companies have basically led India's economic diplomacy, right? The US-India civilian nuclear deal was the outcome of Indian software companies being embedded in US multinationals, where our software players are plugged into the guts of these corporations, and there is no pushback. The trust is complete, but Indian companies are bashful. We still don't see TCS or Infosys. I mean, they might sponsor a chair here and they might do some advertising, but they don't really promote themselves abroad, and they don't work with their missions. They prefer to sit in the background and allow other companies, the Chinese companies, to take the forefront. So they see foreign policy as being the government's job, but it is not, right? And we saw that when we set up Gateway House in Mumbai a decade ago, and this still holds true. They would say, oh, why are you trying to do foreign policy from Mumbai? How to tell them? You are sitting in India's most international cities, and if you don't know that, I don't know what to say. So our foreign ministry, I think, along with think tanks like ours, must have an active outreach program to corporate India to make them understand that foreign policy is also for them to do. We need many, many hands to embrace the world with. And corporate India should not just do it through chambers of commerce, but they really need to do it on their own.
I'm glad you mentioned Gateway House. Now, one of the focus areas of Gateway House is geoeconomics, which is most commonly understood as the use of economic tools to advance geopolitical objectives. China is arguably the world's most prominent practitioner of geoeconomics, and it has increasingly weaponized everything from trade to aid to further its political and security interests. How do you see China's geoeconomic strategy, and is there a backlash against it?
So China has done 2 things, right? It has occupied the UN and other multilateral bodies with their people at all levels and across all horizontals. We did a report on this last year, and it's quite remarkable. I think out of 15 principal agencies, China occupies the top spot in 4 and the second spot in 3, etc. And they are everywhere. And it is alarming. Now the world is starting to recognize its own neglect of these multilateral bodies that it took for granted, and it is changing. India has a very good role to play because our smart young people will be welcomed in these bodies, and we must train them for it. Second is China's Belt and Road Initiative, the big connectivity project, which is now showing serious cracks, not just for those countries which are drowning in debt to China, but also for the Chinese companies that are involved in this build-out, and they are finding themselves both in financial trouble and a lot of local resistance. We were in China 3 years ago, just before the pandemic, and there was a real complaint by these companies about how they were being compelled to go and do these projects, just because they got government money, and they really couldn't back out. So again, this is a good time for the rest of the world to roll out its many plans for development, from the Blue Dot network to Build Back Better to the EU's global gateway to counter China. And I think India really should start to not worry about US sanctions, just like China is able to get around them. We should be able to do it also and begin our own connectivity projects, right? So we can do the North-South International Corridor. We really have to work with Iran on that. We need to get access to places like Central Asia and Europe. We can use Kashmir. Navdeep, you mentioned Kashmir. Kashmir can easily have connectivity to Central Asia. It's not that difficult. It's close by air connectivity, maybe 40 minutes. So we have to think creatively about how we can also participate in this. while the world is now realizing that they cannot depend on China.
Ambassador Suri, following on from what Manjeet said, China has employed its model of geoeconomics in various parts of the world, but especially in Africa and India's neighborhood. Can India challenge the Chinese narrative? And if so, how?
We can and we must. We've both served in Africa over the years, and I can tell you that I have heard stories firsthand from African ministers about Chinese malpractice in Africa. So I think we don't want to be in a situation where a country like Zimbabwe is fighting elections on an anti-China platform. We don't want to become a part of the controversy in those countries. The kind of indebtedness that we are seeing from Ghana all the way to Kenya right now. So I think we have a different development model for which we are rightly respected. Africans, generally speaking, respect the fact that Indians have helped build capacity. Look at our model when we set up a center for excellence in IT in a place like Ghana. After 5 years, we hand it over to the Ghanaians to run that center. And they appreciate that. And the contrast with the Chinese model, where everything comes from China, down to the last nut and bolt, and even the instruction manual is in Chinese, in Mandarin, how can people carry on? So I would say that we should be smart in our development cooperation. We don't have the trillions of dollars that the Chinese have to throw money around. We currently don't build infrastructure as efficiently as the Chinese do, but we do a lot of other things very well, and we should play to our strengths rather than trying to emulate China in Africa.
Manjeet ji, we are increasingly seeing artificial intelligence, the fourth industrial revolution, and 5G as the emerging backbone of economic growth. How can India shape the new narrative of economic diplomacy, given its strengths in services, technology, and digitization?
India is already shaping the new global narrative of diplomacy through its digital efforts. As you know, our software, our back office work was the third wave of globalization. We made it happen, but we never really took credit for it. We didn't do a lot, except we got embedded in countries even further than we were. But today, we've got something really unique. It is called digital public goods. And India is the creator of digital public goods. It's open source. It's been tested at continental scale. We all know when we make a payment, it's best based on India Stack. It's a new architecture. And it started with that foundational ID called the Aadhaar. This has developed into this India Stack, which has enabled our astonishing fintech and now health and education and urban governance. It's a governance platform on technology, and it's available for free to any country that wants to use it. So Vikas, just like India has the world's fastest stock trade settlement system, T+2, we now also have the world's fastest consumer loans approval system. The government has made the technology free and available to the private sector. So not only does the direct benefit transfer to the poor move into their bank accounts in minutes, but the private consumer loan for, say, a washing machine is approved in 4 minutes. And Indian companies also rapidly digitizing their own operations. So as we move into the fourth industrial revolution, we are actually doing it through digital manufacturing. And the government is on top of this. The MEA has started a new division called NEST, as you know, New Emerging and Strategic Technology, to merge technology policy with foreign policy. To really make this work, though, India needs an Indian digital service comprising talented technologists who can help keep the government ahead. We need them to be posted across our missions, and most importantly, cybersecurity is a big threat to our digital ambitions. We need to be on top of it digitally across the board, 360 degrees.
Ambassador Suri, Manjeet mentioned that India needs an Indian digital service. But it has also been argued that India needs dedicated trade specialists for economic diplomacy rather than just relying upon our diplomats. Do you agree?
I don't agree with the fact that you need necessarily specialists from other areas. What I'm very open to is the idea that we should supplement the role played by our diplomats in economic diplomacy with experts that we can hire locally. The problem that we have today, Vikas, in our diplomatic missions is that, particularly in the developed countries, nowhere can we pay a salary that is adequate to hire the best local talent. We need to fix that. most of our locally hired staff are Indian nationals, some of them very good, some of them unemployable in any situation. Compare that with the foreign diplomatic missions in Delhi and look at the top Indian talent that they hire. The second thing I would say is trade negotiations today, which are conducted by the Department of Commerce, are increasingly a very, very specialized area.
Yes.
You can't have a situation of officers coming for 2 years or 3 years and moving on to something else. You know, when you look at your trade negotiation counterparts, the teams that they bring to the table, they've been in those jobs for decades. They know 4 of your predecessors. So unless we can build that expertise and institutional memory, I think we will find ourselves at the receiving end of trade negotiations.
Finally, as the focus of the world shifts from the North Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific as the engine room of global growth for the next 30 to 50 years, how should India position itself to benefit from this geopolitical shift?
So first, India is going to be the G20 president in 2023. We need to get our G20 agenda together. We are already in the Troika, and we need to showcase our seriousness. This is the time to do it. Second, we need to get into trade agreements and build new bonds. Third, we need to use the Quad to experiment with partnerships and economic engagements. Fourth, we need to spread our digital public goods story. It's really virtuous and it's fantastic for the world. Fifth, we need to invest in research at home, and we need to build our capacity.
Ambassador Suri?
I would absolutely agree with what Manjeet has said. I think the Quad shows a lot of potential to be a bridgehead for us in the Indo-Pacific as we move forward. And I think we have to thank the Chinese for being such great catalysts in bringing everybody together under one umbrella and actually activating an organization that had not only been dormant, but looking for a purpose. I think beyond that, we need to get our act together. Again, I come back to the notion, to the principle that India is a federal structure. The Prime Minister, the government has done a lot in terms of promoting ease of doing business, but it is not consistent across states. It pains me that some of the investment that is moving out of China is going to several other countries. Yeah. We should have been in a pole position to attract that investment. As the world moves towards reducing its dependency on China, it isn't enough for me to say I've got an iPhone assembly facility from Foxconn or something else. This is only the tip of the iceberg. So I would really say that, again, a whole of government, cooperative federalism effort where state and center move hand in hand with our diplomatic missions. And we really go all out to attract those large companies that are today seeking to move out of China. We should be the ideal home for them. We need to position ourselves for it, and we need to create examples and success stories that become the talk of the international business community.
Thank you to both my panelists. Their insights have enhanced our understanding of economic diplomacy and how Indian missions abroad are advancing the country's economic agenda by improving trade, facilitating inward foreign direct investment, and creating opportunities for Indian business abroad. In other words, the business of Indian diplomacy is increasingly business. That concludes our business for tonight. Join me next week for another edition of Diplomatic Dispatch. Till then, good evening and goodbye.